Hello, friends. Today is Good Friday, and I expect that you'll be seeing this video sometime, I hope on Friday evening or perhaps on Saturday. But the ministry team and I decided that we wanted to offer an additional video besides the ones that we've been offering on Sundays because of this important week that we call Holy Week. And so I'm going to share with you a few thoughts and some scripture. And Joe Miller is going to be providing some music that's appropriate for this important day. We've been journeying through Jesus in this last week of his life. We started on Palm Sunday. And yesterday, Thursday, was Maundy Thursday. Maundy Thursday is an important day because that's the day when we remember that Jesus had that Last Supper, that Passover meal, because Jesus was a faithful Jew, that Jesus had that Passover meal with his disciples. And that on that night, as also recorded in John's Gospel, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples as a way of showing his love for him and the way that true love is manifest in servanthood and caring for others in a humble way, not lauding one's power over others. And so on Maundy Thursday, and by the way, Maundy, it's a funny word. I grew up in a tradition where we didn't talk about Maundy Thursday. I learned about it later in life, but I think it's very important and very meaningful. Maundy comes from a Latin word, mandatum. That's the word from which we get the English word mandate. So Maundy comes from mandatum, mandate, or commandment. And the commandment that's being referred to there is the commandment that Jesus gave to his disciples in the Gospel of John at that Last Supper. He said, "For I now give you a new commandment, that you are to love one another." That's the kind of commandment I like. Isn't it one that you like? The kind of commandment that's about love and not about doing something harsh or unpleasant. But to love one another, Jesus said, this is what I'm commanding you to do, to love one another. And that's what he called his disciples to do. That's what he calls us to do. And then, of course, Jesus himself said, greater love has no man than that he lay down his life for his friends. And so we move from the story of Jesus being arrested and tried until that Friday where Jesus was crucified. Let me say a word about crucifixion. Crucifixion was not only a way to execute people, but it was a way to send a message. The Roman Empire used crucifixion as a way to terrorize people, to intimidate people, to say, don't try anything because this might happen to you too. So crucifixion was almost always done in a very public way, so that people would see the lengths to which the Roman occupiers would go to keep people down. And of course, Jesus was a threat to them, and Jesus was a threat to some in the religious establishment of his day, some of the Jewish leaders who were in collaboration with the Romans. We should be careful not to talk about the Jews as those who killed Jesus. That's been a sad story in some of Christian history, that some people have said that, it was the Jews that killed Jesus. Well, it wasn't the Jews who killed Jesus. It was the Roman Empire, the dominating group, who had some collaborators, some people that were benefiting from the occupation, some of the religious leaders who were in positions of privilege and power. And Jesus was a threat to them because Jesus was preaching a kind of message that says, the low shall be lifted up. They didn't like that kind of talk. And so they put Jesus to death. And of course, Jesus going to the cross and being willing to die without resistance, without a fight, was a way to show the love of God in a way that had never been shown before. It was a way to expose the moral bankruptcy, the evil of the system that put people down and kept people in positions in which they were oppressed. And so the love of God was made clear on the cross as Jesus died on the cross, that cruel, horrible death. And so what I want to do this evening is to share some scripture passages that are often called the 7 last words of Christ. And I have 7 candles here, as you can see. And after I read each of the sayings of Jesus, I'm going to let the scripture speak for itself. I'm not going to do any commenting on them, but these are words that you'll remember as you hear them read. These 7 last words of Christ. I had the privilege one time to preach at an African-American church, a very historic African-American church in Atlanta called Wheat Street Baptist Church. and there were 7 sermons in a row. I was one of 7. It went on for hours, literally. But that was a tradition that they had in that church, and people came from other churches, and it was a time of powerful worship, the 7 last words of Christ, and a different preacher preached on each one of these words. So I'm not going to do that this evening, but I am going to share with you the 7 last words of Christ and let the Scripture speak for itself. So here again, this powerful and familiar story as you hear the words of Scripture read. The first word comes from the Gospel of Luke. Two criminals were also led out with him to be executed. And when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one at his right and one at his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." The second word, also from the Gospel of Luke. One of the criminals who had been hanged also abused him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us as well." But the other checked him, saying, "Have you no fear even of God? You are suffering the same punishment as he, and we suffer justly. We are getting what we deserve for our deeds, but he has done no harm." And he added, "Jesus, do not forget me when you come to reign." "I tell you truly," said Jesus, "you will be in paradise with me this very day." The third reading comes from the Gospel of John. Now beside the cross of Jesus stood his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. So when Jesus saw his mother and his favorite disciple standing near, he said to his mother, "Woman, there is your son." And then he said to the disciple, "And there is your mother." The fourth reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew. Now from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, darkness covered all the land. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus gave a loud cry, "Ele, Ele, lama sabachthani." That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The fifth reading comes from the Gospel of John. After that, as Jesus knew that everything was now finished and fulfilled, he said, to fulfill the Scripture, "I am thirsty." A jug full of vinegar was lying there. So they put a sponge full of vinegar on a spear and held it to his lips. The sixth reading also comes from the Gospel of John. And when Jesus took the vinegar, he said, "It is finished," bowed his head, and gave up his spirit. seventh and last reading comes from the Gospel of Luke. By this time it was about 12 o'clock, and darkness covered the whole land till 3 o'clock, owing to an eclipse of the sun. The curtain in the middle of the temple was torn in two. Then with a loud cry, Jesus said, "Father, I trust my spirit to thy hands." And with these words, he expired. In order to fully celebrate the resurrection on Easter Sunday morning, it's important that we don't skip over the cross. There's no way that we can fully appreciate and feel the impact and be transformed by the wonderful truth of Easter Sunday until we stop, pause, and reflect on Good Friday.
I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died. My richest gain I count but loss, and more content on all my pride. See from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet, or thorns composed so rich a crown? Oh, the wonderful cross, oh, the wonderful cross, bids me come and die and find that I may truly live. Oh, the wonderful cross, oh, the wonderful cross, all who gather here by grace draw near and bless your name. Where the whole rim of nature wide, that were an offering far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, here.